Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. Today's episode is one of a kind because I am pleased to be joined by Jean Williams, who is a professor and author that has extensively covered and written about women's sports, specifically the historical aspects of it. Jean has published multiple books on the history of different women's sports and the social context that they've lived in. And the most recent book basically captures so much history and is going to be the topic of the conversation today, which is Legendary Lionesses, detailing the England women's national team from 1972, which is around where they were allowed to play football, and that ban was lifted up until 2022, which obviously is the year they achieved glory at the Euros. Jean, pleased to have you on today. How are you doing?
Really good, thank you, Mariam. And I'm delighted to meet you electronically and hope that we can meet in person
Hopefully.
soon. I just want to thank you before we get going for all of the work that you do, somebody that I follow. And it's such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. That is very kind of you. As a person who read the book initially and was like, this is such incredible work, and now to get to talk to you about the book is an incredible honor of mine. So without further ado, let's get started because this is, I feel like, a really, really great book that not only raised a lot of new ideas for me and kind of questions and imposed a lot of critical thoughts about women's sports, but I also think it's a lot of knowledge and kind of data that isn't really out there, which, we'll talk about accessibility issues and whatnot. But kind of starting the introduction and setting the tone about the book, you detail something so important, and I really liked how you mentioned it, and kind of that was like the start before I went on to read everything else. But you wrote that change is not the same thing as progress, which I feel like is a term we kind of use very interchangeably in the sport. Why was it important for you to highlight such, and in what ways did we see that distinction play out from the historical timeline that you covered?
Okay, yeah, it's a really good question in terms of this has been a question that I've been addressing throughout my career. So I've been writing about just this issue for 25 years, which is I don't accept the narrative of progress because I think the narrative of progress, women's sport is making progress, actually problematizes women. It's what we call the Me Too version of history.
Hmm.
So, if we accept the notion of progress, are we then able to articulate what we appear to be progressing towards? Can you say what you would like women's sport and women's football to look like when we actually arrive at the moment of all this progress? And
Hmm.
actually, most people can't do that. So, and I actually think that the narrative of progress helps in the continued misogynistic treatment of
Hmm.
women's sport. So
Hmm.
FIFA can say, oh, look, we've had the biggest ever Women's World Cup, which is the constant narrative that FIFA has. Every
Hmm.
World Cup, Women's World Cup that we have is the biggest that we've had.
Yeah.
And to what end? What does that narrative actually hide? So, as historians, we talk about continuity and change rather than as progress, and that shouldn't um, be a surprise to anyone. And what continuity and change does, it allows us to say, okay, so Spain just won Women's World Cup for the first time in their history, but look at the continuity of the governance around the Spanish National Association.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you find out that not only Luis Rubiales, but his dad works for the Spanish National Association, you're
Yeah.
thinking, well, you know, is everybody there on merit?
Yeah.
Or, you know, what are the politics at play?
Hmm.
So for me, I'd have had equal pay at the last World Cup. And this notion that somehow women's football's got to develop more in order to be worthy of equal prize money is, I think, part of the continued problem of that narrative. What is really apparent in the writing around much of women's football is that people become fans around the time of a World Cup. So there was a big upsurge in fandom around 2019
Hmm.
that translated into a certain kind of journalism that said France was a new moment for women's football. But actually, if you look at the performance, I sat in the stands when England played USA,
Hmm.
and I looked at the shoulders. You've played your sport, reading the body language. I could tell from the body language of the England players before they kicked off against USA that we were beaten. And so there was a certain kind of atmosphere within England training camps that I've written about. There was, grown women who were not encouraged to have an opinion about what was going on. So for me, the Serena Wiegman revolution is a very, very recent revolution, because what she encouraged the England team to do, and I've been part of that process, so I've seen how she's done it,
Hmm.
is that she's encouraged the England team not only to have an opinion, not only to talk about their heritage and how that fits into a wider narrative of what they might do as a team, but she's encouraged them to stand for more than themselves. And in this case, it's the longer history of women's football and people who have fought their way under very difficult circumstances to the relative privilege of where the England squad are now.
Yeah.
Because I think they played at the Women's Euros particularly for something more than themselves. That kind of released the sort of euphoria that we got at Wembley when we won, because it was just a moment of collective joy.
Hmm.
And in saying that, I was on the same row as some Germany fans, and everybody, although obviously Germany was devastated not to win,
Yeah.
and we were very fortunate. England were very fortunate that Alexandra Pop was injured. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna take away from that for 1 second. But it was just a moment of euphoria and joy, because to fill Wembley on such a perfect July day and to have a performance in a game like that was just pure joy, and everybody was in tears.
It's funny you mentioned tears and joy because, when you cut up those chapters to get to that Serena Wiegman, to get to that euphoria that you mentioned, there was a lot of joy and then there was a lot of tears. And then once again, you had a mix of emotions. And it's quite a roller coaster to really follow that historical standpoint. And you cut up the chapters up to 5 chapters, or eras, as you refer to them often in the book. And you started in the 1860s. Why begin there?
Because football was codified in the 1860s, and although there were forms of folk football and shushu and those sorts of things that you and your listeners will know about before then, codified modern sport really begins when we have national sets of rules,
Mm.
because what that enables people to do is you have these simple 11 rules, but then you can easily transport them and you can take them abroad and you can take them to people who you want to play against and say, right, these are the rules by which we're going to play.
Hmm.
And I thought it was really important to acknowledge that although that image that I often refer to from Harper's Bazaar is from the 1860s, obviously it's not a photograph of a women's game in the 1860s, because photography was a new technology and those things just would not have been around. The fact that it's recorded as an image at all, sufficient to stimulate somebody to want to record that moment, for me was interesting, because it talks to an assertive female physicality. And in the UK, everybody thinks of the Victorian era as being dominated by Queen Victoria, a rather large, dumpy lady with about 9 kids in corsets. And so to contradict that image of this lady, I think it's really important to say that women were being physically assertive, and they were being treated quite violently for that. So women who cycled were often pushed off their bikes. Women who were equestrians were often attacked. And it was just that idea of women taking to the field and taking up that resource and space that was threatening to a lot of people. But nevertheless, modern women were very much there at the start of the birth of modern sport.
That was something I was actually unaware of, generally, and how they existed in terms of not only just sports, but the social context of it all in that time. So, kind of setting that foundation, and starting from there to see how things slowly but surely changed was quite interesting. And again, kind of new to me. And across we see, and you mentioned kind of governing bodies, but I think what was so stark to me was that the FA is so involved in how the Lionesses either improved or regressed. And so if the FA was taking a step forward, so was the team. And if the FA was taking a step back, so was the team. It was like they were always moving in parallel. And, when they were banned, they were not there. But then when they were allowed, they boomed like crazy. And I think, again, in the current day, we always talk about how important the Federation trusts the team and invests in it. But that storyline has been there since the existence of any governance body that took on any women's national team, really. Can you tell me, I guess, a little bit more about how their role in every era that you described and wrote about, from day one, played such an important role to how things evolved across?
Yeah, I think it's the notion of space. So if you think about the FA when it formed in 1863,
Hmm.
it was a small, not particularly influential governing body, and nor did it want to be. It was a bunch of ex-Oxford and Cambridge graduates who
Yeah.
basically wanted to play against their own social class, let alone against allow thinking of women or diversity in any kind of way. So they were just not interested in that. And there's a fantastic quote actually in some of the early FA games where one guy basically complains that another guy had not passed to him. And he says, I'm playing entirely for my own enjoyment, sir. I'm never going to pass to you because it's all about me dribbling the ball and having as much fun as I can.
Yeah.
So that sort of sums up the FA in that era. And I think then what happens is, although there are these games from around 1895, the British Ladies Football Club, these are female penny entrepreneurs. And today, Nettie Honeyball would have been an Instagram influencer because she understood 9 months before their first match that she cultivated the press, and she said, I know this is topical, I know this is challenging to public perception, this is what we're going to do. And she spoke to as many newspapers as she could, and hey ho, she got a crowd of 10,000 paying spectators at her first match.
Hmm.
So very clever entrepreneurial behavior. And then they go on to play 150 matches, helped by the newly instigated national rail schedule, which
Mm.
means that they can predict when the train's going to be, and they can say, we're going to play you here. Move forward to World War One, and women move into the factories. And again, that's a kind of assertive female physicality,
Hmm.
but it's a kind of double war work. So the FA is still not condoning these games, but the women are going, all right, I'm going to work in a dirty and dangerous factory in the day, and I'm going to play football evenings and weekends to raise money for charity
Hmm.
for men who are fighting at the front. And that's why the idea of a ban in 1921, I
Mm.
would argue, is particularly spiteful because these women had done a double kind of war work and were doing their patriotic duty.
Yeah.
So to tarnish that with a ban on playing on grounds reflected how conservative the FA was. And fast forward in England, an organisation called the WFA was formed in 1969, which is why we get the first England team
Hmm.
in 1972. But the FA proper did not take control of women's football till 1993.
Yeah.
And so the women who play in that first period that I speak about, in the 70s and the 80s, was so amateur in terms of the lack of help and support that they had,
Mm.
that they are absolutely the most dedicated pioneers. And that's why I've written more about them in this book, particularly because they're getting on to be in their, mid to late 70s, some of them, and mid 60s. Because if we don't capture those stories now, um, and what's really important about that to resist this narrative of progress is women's football's not new. It's just been hidden.
Yeah. And you referenced 1920, which again, reading so much about that time, you just mentioned how a lot of the ideas in women kind of challenging the press and challenging the I guess the ideologies around them is very similar to kind of what we're seeing today in that in their rise and their progression and their change and kind of the game booming really. But so was the numbers in attendance. You were seeing 10,000 people in attendance, 25,000 for that Dicker against France game. Like these are huge, huge numbers that again have never really been talked about. They're hidden. But I don't think anybody that is following the game would have known that in 1920s a team in England was pulling 25,000 spectators in there. So is that also something that you wanted to make sure you highlighted in terms of it was just social context, it was the attitudes that in 1920 as it is now in 2024?
Yeah, I couldn't I couldn't reinforce that point strongly enough, and you just articulated it brilliantly. So what we have to understand in the 1920s, because that ban didn't come about until 1921, and the war was over by then. But what happened was that men turned out in their droves, and there's a misperception about football in World War One. Professional football continued. Male professional football continued. It never was the case that women's football was drawing large enough crowds consistently to threaten the male football league.
Hmm.
Which regionalised and, as I said, continued. And there were also a lot of men's clubs that played matches to raise money for charity. So it wasn't just women's football.
Yeah.
We can kind of nuance the argument. But what the working class men who turned out in their numbers, as you say, during World War One and shortly after could see is that the women were being patriotic and actually often raising money for charities that were helping wounded soldiers.
Mm.
Either mental health charities
Yeah.
or other forms of support. And very often the other charities that they raised money for were health charities, which were the least kind of glamorous charities, if I could put it like that.
Mm.
Conditions that people didn't really want to talk about in the 1920s, when not being 100% fit was not thought to be a disability in the way that we think of it now.
Hmm.
It was thought to be a kind of weakness, and people didn't necessarily want to help the people who were socially marginalised.
Hmm.
So the working class men who paid their money week in, week out understood the context of that. So the masculinity was different,
Mm.
but also these were really good games of football, and people watched them for all the reasons that we watch really good football. They'd go and have a beer with their mates. They'd probably have a little side flutter or a gamble. They'd talk about it. It'd be their kind of soap opera, all the stuff that we all do now. What we also have to realise is in the era that modern women's football from the 70s has become more widespread and known about, the media diet is very, very different.
Mm.
And the misogyny that we're seeing on social media and those other things has been present in that current media era while women's football's been coming up.
Charity is a word that is becomes it holds a lot of importance in the answer that you just had, but also in the book because the ban and you wrote exactly what the ban was written about, and it was the ban exactly said that too much money had been absorbed in expenses and not donated to charity, and therefore the ban was put and they couldn't play any more football. Was that would you say the collective conscious of society at that time that this was going to be something that was solely used for charity, and when it was not fulfilling its duties of being a charity, then that was the punishment we had to put on it? And do you feel like we still see some of that, afterthought, or women's football is still a charity this present day? Like, is there a connection, from the ideal of what women's football should do with the money around it, because it was seen as charity, and when it wasn't doing that, it was banned?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of that early era, obviously the women in World War One and shortly after were amateurs, and they gave up their own time. And I think the thing that really ticked off the FA about that is that they became sort of local celebrities. I mean, if you look at Dick Kerrs, if you look at Lily Parr, you're as likely to see her in a posh evening frock having a drink after the match with the alderman of Preston or whatever civic dignitaries invited them to an evening meal and maybe a show and all
Yeah.
the rest of it, as you are in her football kit. So she became known as a media personality. And that was threatening, I would suggest,
Mm.
to the FA. And they had no way of regulating what were called broken time payments. So if you were paid a little bit of expenses or a little bit of money for not being at work, they had no way of regulating that. And it's something that the FA were and the Football League were very, very concerned about right up until the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
which is why you don't get the sort of superstars like Bobby Moore and George Best and all of those kind of people
Mm-hmm.
until the end of the maximum wage and the retain and transfer system in men's football in the 1960s.
Mm.
So when England women start again under the WFA in 1969, the FA put no money into that at all. They're actually funded by a grant funding body who only funds amateur athletes. And so the WFA are frightened throughout their whole existence, 1969 until 1993,
Mm-hmm.
that they're somehow going to get caught out. And to the extent of, I give the example of Joan Briggs, who captained an unofficial England team out to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And the BBC wanted to interview Joan about her experiences and offered her literally a couple of pounds to be interviewed. And the WFA turned it down unless all of the players are considered to be professionals. So very little money put in until 1993 when the FA take over. And then they don't appoint the first full-time England coach until Hope Powell in 1998.
Yeah.
And all of the players are still amateurs. And Hope Powell really realises that if we want to improve our standard, we have to professionalise. And that's where she brings in the WSL. So I
Yeah.
almost feel like Hope isn't given the credit that she deserves
Yeah.
in revolutionising England women's football team.
And you have a big chapter on Hopel because she was a lot of firsts. And she was born in 1966 when the ban was still in place. And so she wasn't born at a time where she could see herself be that full-time manager. How crucial was it for you to cover her effects on the sport in the book?
Absolutely crucial in terms of, you know, she's a slight figure. And she's a very sort of modest and humble person, but she bore an awful lot on her shoulders. So, in terms of her playing career, she was vice captain of the England women's team and played along of the era of Brenda Sempare, who honestly, I remember seeing Brenda Sempare play as a kid. And you have never seen such an elegant midfielder as Brenda of that era, honestly, yeah. Just phenomenal. And then as England manager, Hope was able to develop the careers of people like Sammy Britton, played alongside Kerry Davis, later Anita Asante. And so the diversity of the England team really grew under Hope Powell and things that she initiated.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who was so very young in being appointed an England manager, the first black manager for England, the first out gay manager for England, it was a lot for an individual to take on. Mm-hmm. And she was also up against attitudes at the FA where women's football was perceived to be an economic drain, not an economic asset. So it was really important for me to cover her career, but also the network around her of people who were helping to make that kind of change. And
Hmm.
obviously, really pivotal in that was Kelly Simmons.
Yeah. You mentioned that she obviously was the first full-time head coach, the first black manager, the first gay, out manager, and I think she set the stone and she set I guess the standard for a lot of the players that came after her, that it was okay to be X, Y, and Z. It was you saw this happening around you, you saw the standard, you saw the environment of having players like Anita Asante, you saw all of that and it was normalized. And I think had she not done that, the England team would look different. The England number of players that have been through the pipeline would also look a little bit different. And also a player that I think now obviously gets praised for a lot of her punditry work and her club career. But Kelly Smith is an area that you say changed the game. Um, what was your favorite part to write about her, given the influence that she had and just kind of the power of personality that she carried with her on and off the pitch, really?
Yeah, is that I almost feel sad is too strong, but Kelly Smith was an outstanding, outrageously gifted player in an era when the England team was not very much supported by the FA.
Mm,
And you sort of think that she didn't get the platform that she and her teammates could have had with more investment to get us to where we are now a lot quicker.
mm,
So Kelly Smith could have been Leah Williamson.
mm,
She was in an era where England, first qualified for a World Cup in 1995 and then didn't do so well in terms of qualifying for World Cups, didn't
mm,
get there in 1999, 2003, get there in 2007. There wasn't that stage for Kelly's talents
mhm,
that she deserved, and there wasn't the club level football that her talents deserved. And yet, it was quite routine for her to be nominated as part of World 11s
mm,
when the England team were not getting through to semi finals, into finals.
yeah.
And the fact that she went to America in order to fulfill her dream to become a professional footballer in the college system there is fantastic. And again, really trailblazing. It cost her a lot in terms of her personality
Mm,
and her preparedness for what that meant for her. But she was also injured a lot. And that was because the backroom functions of women's football were just not in place. So we talk about amateurism, but the physiology, the psychology, the nutrition, the strength and conditioning, all of that was just not there. And it was very much down to players to develop for themselves. So she was helped, yes, by getting into the Arsenal setup, but even within that, Arsenal were better prepared than most,
mm.
but still pretty amateur in the way that they approach the game.
I think that is something that after every era or every chapter that I read in the book, it's like this could have been or what if, and something that I would highly advise people to not only go and buy the book and read, but specifically read about the interviews that you wrote about that first 11, because they shared their experience. And then, there was a lot of referencing in their stories about having to do extra to get boots or to, whatever it may be to get into that first 11. So that's a portion of the book that I hope folks are able to get directed to. But kind of you see the struggles of Kelly Smith, Ellen White, and the glory of what happens at the end of her career, which is heavily around Serena Wiegman. And the final section of Serena Wiegman is titled Queen Serena, which it feels like the cherry on top. It is the cherry on top, with how you conducted her part. How do you feel she resembles everything the book talks about in terms of fights, hostility, passion, character, trophy, kind of standing up for yourself? And you talked a little bit about it earlier that when she came into that setup now, she allowed the players to know that they're playing more than just football on the pitch. But that title in Queen Serena is like you read it and you're like, yeah, there's not much more to say. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Yes, all hail Queen Serena. Okay, so the thing about Serena Wiegman as a coach, and again, if people have recently become a fan, you may not realise that Serena Wiegman was the first full-time England women's coach appointed with proven international expertise.
Hmm.
So that's how recent that change has been. When Hope Powell was appointed, she didn't have her top level coaching badges.
No.
The Mark Sampson era, I pass over very briefly. Don't really want to say too much more about that.
Yeah.
Gary
Very
Neville
Neville.
was an interesting appointment on his way to Miami, I would suggest. It was basically a shop window for him. And then we get Serena Wiegman. And of course, what she did with the Netherlands in 2017 was win the Euros on home soil, which had never been done with that national team before.
Mm-hmm.
And then she takes them to a final of a World Cup, appointed with England, and then takes England to a home Euros and wins, and then takes England to the finals of a Women's World Cup. And that's within 2 years of touching down as England coach. So that's been fascinating for me to see. And the thing about her personally, again, I've just had her autobiography on audiobook, is that you realize that the things that I've been describing to you about the England setup, Serena lived through. So she was a very, very good international player for the Netherlands. And then she goes over to America to try to progress her coaching career. The Tar Heels are really important in her journey and to see what is possible in America.
Yeah.
And then comes back and has to be a PE teacher while she has her two daughters. And it's only relatively late in her own life that she gets to become a full-time football coach. And so, of course, she's been on exactly the journey of the people that I've been describing, you know, the Gillian Coulthards and the Deb Bamptons and the Kelly Smith and those kinds of people.
No.
But I think one of the things that's really interesting when you compare that with the coaching journey or the lack of coaching journey that's available to ex-England internationals is that Germany particularly has been very good at retaining its ex-women internationals in the coaching setup. So Tina Thorne-Mayer, you know, mentor Sylvia Need, and Sylvia Need mentors, but that's not available to England players. So maybe Kerry Davis would have liked to have been a coach, but there wasn't that possibility. And if you do your A license, it's at least £7,000, and you have to be referred, and you have to have access to elite coaching opportunities to progress your career.
Yeah.
So we haven't been very good at retaining and training up our own women coaches within the setup, so that we now need to bring in a foreign manager and coach with the setup that Serena has. So it sort of highlights the disparity that we still have to develop that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how, you know, she fills a lot of, I guess, the disparity or what was never there. She fills a lot of it up. But at the same time, she subsequently shows us that there's still disparity to work with and there's still more to fill out. And I'm mindful here of our time. Unfortunately, we can't sit and talk about this all day because I would absolutely love. But is there a part of the book that kind of holds a special place in your heart? Because like you mentioned, this took years to write. And I'm sure, and you can possibly add on to that how data about this is not easy to access and write about and accurately report on. But, is there a moment or a chapter or I guess a story or interview that made it or didn't make it that was most memorable to you? Or is there a favorite line that you highlight in this book that just kind of like it holds a special place in your heart?
For me, the first 11 chapter is the most significant, and that's because the women who first appeared for England in 1972 in the first ever official match against Scotland,
Yeah.
um, they had to have played during the ban to be good enough to be selected for England when those trials were held. And it's not commonly known, and it's not currently a subject of much academic research, but in society in general, dementia affects women 4 times more than it does men in terms of not just suffering from dementia themselves, but also being carers and having the kind of financial and social responsibility
Mm.
around dementia. And we fortunately have not lost many of the women from 1972, although we have now lost a couple from the overall number of 227 women that
Yeah.
appeared for England up till 2022. But I noticed, particularly, and I talk about it in the chapter, that I had to do some of the interviews with a friend of a player
Mm.
because they were starting to lose some of their memories. And that's why it's so vital to do this work to capture their memories now, because they had to be really super interesting and characterful women. Otherwise, they'd just have taken up knitting or crochet or something else. So, and the example of Sue Buckett, who's the first goalkeeper for England in 1972, Sue Buckett, the goalkeeping coaching for women was so poor that she actually just buys a copy of Bob Wilson's book and teaches herself goalkeeping from a book. What determination, what an interesting person. She was a very good all-round sportswoman and was a very good canoeist. When
Mm.
I spoke to Sue, she was still doing Keep Fit in her 80s, and she was gardening and, all of these fantastic things. She'd had an amazing career. So those inspirational women who society said, football's unsuitable for women, why don't you go away and do something else? And they just turned around and went, do you know what? No.
Yeah. I think reading those interviews and the stories about them was it kind of like set me back for a moment to say that without them, we would have never had the Leah Williamson. We would have never had the Ellen Whites. They were so crucial to not only proving so many wrong, but just proving and showing that there is a place for women's football and there is a place to have 11 players get fielded with such level, with such passion, with such grit that um, I'm not surprised to hear that that chapter holds a lot of value to your heart because I think it holds a lot of value to the football in England. With a lot of folks now, hopefully, able to pick up a book about this or a copy about this, I shall say. What would you tell them for somebody who's just listened to our chat and are going to go ahead and read the book? What are some expectations or things that you'd want them to be mindful as they go through this journey, I would say, because it was quite a journey reading that book.
Yeah, it's although there are challenging aspects of the history of women's football, and it can be infuriating to hear these stories. You do get quite angry
Mm.
in terms of the way in which the women have been treated and the long term damage that's done in some cases. When you actually speak to the women, so I had the good fortune to meet Jeannie Allett, who was the first striker for the England women's team in 1972, and would hitchhike to England training camps and to matches, sleeping on train stations with a knife in her bag just to feel safe while on international duty. If those kind of women don't interest you, then I kind of don't know what kind of women would.
Do.
And it's the story, I think, of women finding a way regardless of whatever barriers were put in their
Yeah.
place. So that kind of story repeats itself again and again. So overall, it's a hugely inspiring story, and I think it just makes the the notion of that day at Wembley in July 2022 all the sweeter, because you realise the emotion that was released at Wembley,
Hmm.
that it's like we're here. I mean, I was actually at Wembley with my niece who I played football with. She was 14 when she joined the women's team, and I was 34. And we played together for a number of years till my knees gave out. And then she was there with my two great nieces who both play football, and they're 12 and 7. And they thought it was perfectly normal to go to Wembley on a sunny day, watch England beat Germany. We all have a bit of a sing along, and England win. And I thought on that day, well, that's made everything that I've done worthwhile.
Yeah. I think it's the sort of book that um you would want to put on the television and watch the entire game back, from the moment they walk out to the moment the you know anthem plays into the hands of the stands. Like it, you get to watch that game all over again with a different understanding to how um they got there. That is something that I personally did right after reading the book, is actually rewatch all of it, like not the highlights, nothing, just moment by moment, kind of let it all play out to, like you mentioned, realize that that is a special, special thing that could have never been there. And I think the book is such an important piece that does a remarkable job of highlighting these stories that maybe 10, 20 years ago would have never been highlighted if it wasn't for the work that you're doing. And like you mentioned, we're kind of on a time limit, unfortunately, because a lot of these women who did what they did are not with us anymore, and it's kind of like a race against time. So it's a book that I hope a lot of folks can head to and read, because it's a it's a lot of history, it's a lot of records, it's a lot of things, it's a lot of characters, it's models, it's inspirational figures, and it's fights. And yeah, I think it book and your work and your writing does such an exceptional job of covering it. I haven't personally read a book that really encaptures a historical timeline of a team um as much as this one does. So for those listening, I will definitely be leaving a link down below to purchase the book. Jean, thank you so much for joining me today. What a pleasure to talk about this great book with you, and just to kind of hear how your thoughts around the book and how you approached it. And if you thought this was, folks listening, if you thought this was anything interesting, then you will most definitely know and be assured that the book is 30 times more interesting, because it is that great. Jean, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mariam. And can I thank you again for your amazing work and the way in which you reach out to younger audiences in what you do, because I definitely think that these stories need to be told to inspire even more girls to carry on with their sport, or whatever is their passion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And thank you so much for saying that. For everybody, head down to the description down below. I'll also leave links to Jean where you can stay updated on her work, any more releases. I'm sure there could be something possibly coming up in the future, as well as the many books that she's already covered, or sorry, she's already published and written before this one, which are of great interest, that also cover a lot of superb stories that have also been put in the shadows from before. And as always, I'll catch you in the other episode.